going to start the recording here. Now, for viruses, in fact, you can, there's a course that I took many years ago called virology. And, we can spend the whole semester learning different viruses. Right? Of course, how much time do we have learning viruses here? Maybe half an hour or so. Okay. And so broadly, like bacteria, you can say virus. Um, Bacteria can either stain gram positive or gram negative. The virus's classification could be dependent on what kind of genetic material does this organism carry. Is this a DNA virus or is it an RNA virus, right? Coronavirus is an RNA virus. Okay, that's good to know because uh, typically, as an RNA virus, uh, some of the virus has to be reverse transcribed. I mean, it brings it, it makes a copy into the DNA, and then the DNA can get incorporated into the host chromosome, like the HIV virus, right? The coronavirus is a little bit different, and that is the RNA virus that is carried can be encoded for the protein particle. So in other words, the ribosome just binds to it and make the protein, um, whatever proteins that it needs to package itself into an envelope and then to leave. But there is a um, there is a period in which the infectious particle with the coronavirus and its RNA genetic material, the virus has to make more of that genetic material, right? Which means it has to make more copy of that RNA. And I don't know if you guys heard, but recently, I think it might have been Merck who have or either in the process of getting approval for the coronavirus pill medication. Yeah, no. Whether you're pregnant or not, you're always going to get a coronavirus that has an RNA component to it. But what the medication does is that it's an analog, it's a nucleotide analog. And what it does is that when a virus that when you're infected with the virus, it needs the nucleotide, your AGCT or in this case, yeah, AGUT to make more of the RNA. Well, it picked up the drugs, right? And then thus the virus started making mutated, if you will, mutating meaning that it won't make a functional genomic material, right? And so that's the benefit of taking this medication. But you have to take it within the window, within 3 or 5 days after you get infection. Is it similar to Tamiflu? Yes, it's kind of similar to, and yes, there is a window you have to take it. Usually, after infection, you have that fever. That's a good time to take it. You can't take it. I don't know prophylactically. In other words, say that you're going to go to let's say Florida. That's not mandate for a person to have vaccine, and you want to go to a crowded place like a restaurant of non-vaccinated people, right? And do you take this medication to protect you with that health? I don't know. I don't know if you can take it prophylactically. Okay. So the discussion here is viruses you can classify either as a DNA virus or RNA virus. single-stranded or double-stranded RNA, whatever, etc. Okay, we're not going to go into that detail other than to tell you that there are viruses that have DNA and RNA, and you don't need to know, adenovirus is a DNA virus. All right. Okay. And some of the viruses typically causes acute infection, like you see here, and some of them is known as chronic or persistent. The acute one are the rhinovirus, norovirus, measles, and hepatitis A. Okay? There are certainly many. We're just going to consider these four. Rhinovirus, the word rhino refers to nose. This is typically a common virus that causes, rhinitis, infections of the nose. Um, Norovirus is typically causes like a diarrhea, uh, and it's often associated with people goes on a cruise ship and they get in, diarrhea. Most of the diarrhea is caused by bacteria, and it's only this is the only virus I know that causes so virus, diarrhea, cruise ship. That's a norovirus. 90% of the people who get diarrhea on a cruise ship is related to this virus. Yeah, so the rhinovirus certainly infected within the nose region, but the parasinus as well. So sinuses are typically are space within the bones that also have surface over it, like the ethmoid bone, the frontal bone, the maxillary bone, right? And sometimes a lot of these infections uh, interfere with the cilia. So you can get accumulations of mucus within the space. So you can develop sinusitis, yes. Measles, typically there are two kinds of measles, rubella and rubeola and rubella, that you see here. Of these two, this one, the measles that we come to know that has become dangerous is this one, rubeola. Okay, and the German measles is in fact rubeola and rubella is caused by two different measles virus. Okay? Both of these you see red spots on the face and spread throughout the body, but in the rubeola, typically when you get infection, here's the incubation period is a little bit longer. Like 7 to 10 days, and the person has fever, infection, and it can run, long time, like a week, to 10 days. German measles, however, is tend to be shorter. Um, it's like 3 days. In fact, German measles is known as 3 days measles because typically people will recover after 3 days, right? And the other distinction between rubeola versus rubella, and that is the presence of coplet spots. And coplet spots are these white spots you see in the back of your throat, typically 2 to 3 days before the onset of fever. Right? While rubella, German measles, might be innocent enough, but it's particularly dangerous. I think one of your colleagues mentions about something about pregnancy, and that if you are pregnant and you're getting rubella, it can causes birth defect, right? It can causes um, you know blindness in the fetus of the fetus, as you will. Okay. And as far as the spot is concerned, while both of them red, but in the German measles is not so red, not so spread red. In the hepatitis A virus, once you get hepatitis A, and you probably hear recently through eating contaminated scallion imported from South America, for example, Mexico. Uh, and the root of the infection is usually orally ingesting of some food. And once you get hepatitis A, right, infection, you get antibody, and those considered as protective antibody like IgG, and that will protect you from future Hep A infection, for example. On the other hand, the chronic or persistent infection, uh, things like herpes, hepatitis B and C, HIV, and human papillomavirus, um, their causes persistent, particularly hepatitis B and C, um, and this is usually transmitted through blood, either IV drug user or transfusion. You know, if you need blood and they give you blood. I know that I'm my sometime in my past, I have come in contact with hepatitis B because I have core antibody to hepatitis B or antibody, or I have antibodies to hepatitis B core antigen. So when I try to give blood, they screen my blood and they see the presence of the antibody. They say, oh, no, thank you. Thank you, but no, thank you. We know that you want to give, but we can't take your blood because if my blood is given to another person, that's how they can come and get infection. Even though the particle themselves is not culturable, you can't see them. We only know that I have it because of the presence of antibody. And you can't risk of giving that, you know, the recipient the blood because they can get contaminated as well, infected as well. In 2020, the the Nobel Prize winner was actually awarded in medicines to a scientist who shows that people with Hep B and C virus infections develop hepatocellular carcinoma. Herpes virus, we're going to talk about different type 1, type 2, or uh, or um, zosters. That's a herpes virus, and the herpes virus is typically once you get it, you can't not get rid of it. It stays within you. Things like chicken pox, you have it um, early in life, you think it goes away, but no, they usually stay within your sensory neuron, and later on they might come back as shingle. Uh, and HIVs, again, it's an RNA virus that reverse transcribe it into DNA, and it can incorporate itself into the host chromosome. So it could lay dormant for years. Human papillomavirus, HPV, uh, association with cervical carcinoma. Okay, so the other thing here just basically shows you rhinovirus um, typically associate with sinusitis because you get a lot of mucus secretion and they get trapped. Daniela, do you have a question? Daniela?
Sorry, yes. I was just curious to know what triggers shingles.
Good question. Um, well, the general answer is that stress. And or you can think of it as the interesting thing with stress is that uh, during a stressful time, your immune system is weak, right? And we can have an argument of um, uh, the um, how certain steroid hormone, for example, is can serve as an immunosuppressor, right? So steroid in general suppress your immune system, right? Now, if you're looking at the organ in our body that produce a lot of steroids, like your gonads, right? But the um, the adrenal cortex, right, also put out steroid like aldosterone, which is known as the mineral corticoid, or cortisol. Cortisol is also known as glucocorticoid. And take, for example, cortisol. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid, and the adrenal cortex, think of it as a way to uh, the hormones there is produced is to manage stress. Okay, so your cortisol in general trying to increase your blood glucose level, and by increasing your blood glucose level, it does by causes glycogen lysis. Right? Your glycogen stores in your liver get degraded, for example. Um, Now, the other argument is that as the B cells produces a lot of antibodies, right, it will need amino acid to make the antibody, right? And let's say that when you stress, and we see that people stress, they lose. Why? Because they break down their glycogen, right? They first break down glycogen and then they break down the fat, right? Lipolysis. And so let's say you use up your glycogen storage, you use up your lipid storage. So now where you're going to get the material to make glucose. Now you want it to bring your glucose level up. So you have to involve in what we consider as gluconeogenesis. And gluconeogenesis, you have to start from not from carbon dioxide and oxygen like plant to make new glucose, but as a carbon source, like pyruvate, for example, right? And where does pyruvate come from? Well, it turns out that some amino acid uh, has a carbon source that can easily convert it to pyruvate or to glutamate from alpha ketoglutarate or and so forth. So the idea here is that during stress, steroids suppress your immune system is to prevent your body from using amino acid, right? Because B cells use amino acid to make antibody so that the amino acid reservoir is readily available to convert it as a glucose as glucose toward the end of the stressful environment. So, and then if you use that, continue having stress, ultimately you will succumb to disease. If you know. Um, all right, so that's a long way to answer that. And what causes shingle? Shingle again, uh, during a stressful situation, the immune system might be weak, and the virus will come out of your sensory neuron, and they usually travel within this band, so you can have a patch of the skin that become irritable, become inflamed, very itchy, oozy, right? Um, and it could be in the arms. So typically, you see a pattern. Now, people's in their 50s, usually 55, it's recommended to get shingle vaccine. Okay? Um, is that the same as what happened with Hep C virus flares, environmental investigations? Yes, but shingle it typically is present um, within the dermatome, if you will, right? The particular part of the skin, right? Hep C and B uh, flare up is not necessary to this patterns of the he sees in the skin. Okay. Um, okay. All right. Um, where are we? Okay, so rhinovirus, norovirus, very common fecal contamination. This is the virus that causes GI tract problem, norovirus associated with cruise ship, okay, abdominal pains, vomiting, diarrhea. German measles, also known as the 3 days measles, is not so severe as rubella. Um, that's the actual measles. And particularly pregnant women have it. They can their child can have conjunctivitis or even blindness, if you will. And rubella or rubella, uh, typically rash um, in their on their skin. Okay. The rubella is also known as the hard measles, okay, whereas and the course of infections is usually longer, more than 3 days, um, with people with sign and symptom. They do get, over time, it goes away. Um, um, yeah, so rubella, you can develop long course, leads to encephalitis. And that's a very severe cases. Okay. Hep A, we are talking about fecal contamination, and Hep B and Hep C, chronic um, infections could lead to hepatocellular carcinoma, often associated with cirrhosis of the liver, and human papillomavirus, although there's different variants and strain of this. Vaccination, including, I think it's like a number of different strains, and that will give you protection for most of the viruses. Um, Herpes simplex, your common uh, cord, cold sore, and again, uh, when does it come out? Typically in your uh, cheek, right, or your lip. It could be related to stress, And again, herpes simplex virus, you don't um, get rid of it. Once you get infected, it you always have it. Type 2 is genital herpes, and it could usually what you see is a blister presence in the genital area, very painful blister, right? And it can ooze. Uh, can herpes type 1 become type 2? No, it's a completely different virus. They have different genetic material. Okay. Um, and yes, this common source usually is passed through saliva, and genital is considered a venereal disease, but it can be passed through saliva as well. I suppose people do other situation. I mean, you know what I mean, right? Outside of in addition to the missionary's position, let's put it that way. Yes, herpes zoster, uh, zoster virus or HZV, causes chicken pox in chicken. Usually, once you have it, you don't have any more chicken pox per se. It's very, very infectious. So when you come in contact with this as children, if they start seeing these spots that you have chicken pox, they send you home right away. Um, uh, and um, and then you don't have it uh, to once you recover, then you're no longer infectious. You can go back to school again. Once you have it, it always stays in your body until it come back out as shingle. And you can get vaccination for shingle. Most likely, the way that vaccination works is probably boost your immune system. Um, and I'm not sure exactly what is in the vaccine, but it's typically boosts your cytotoxic T cells, or hoping that so that if the virus do comes out, it doesn't cause as much pain uh, to that one particular regions of the skin. An Epstein-Barr virus is called mononucleosis, also associated with the Burkitt lymphoma. And we'll see this next as part of the infectious, uh, as part of blood disorder, and how uh, one of the problem that result in leukemia or lymphoma, and again, the difference between leukemia and lymphoma is that in lymphoma, the cancer cell is associated with the lymph node, whereas leukemia, it's simply blood, right? Um, and they have what we consider as the crowd out effect, which means that the cancer cell have grown, have divided so much that it prevented the normal cell from working. Uh, and in the case of the Burkitt lymphoma, for example, not so much Hodgkin. Hodgkin is usually confined within the lymph node in the neck. Okay, but in Burkitt lymphoma, right here, they you also see them in the marrow as well, and so that they divide so much that they prevent your red blood cell produced in the normal marrow, for example. And so your red blood cells started to be made from other area. We call this extramedullary hematopoiesis, right? So uh, typically the area that involved in making red blood cells are the sternum, the iliac crest, the vertebrae, maybe the head of the femur. Typically, these are the area that make you normal blood. Now, if this area now is defective because there's too much cancer cell there, then other places can start it to make, or the marrows of the facial bone starting to make the blood cell. Then you can see facial deformity. That's very common in a case with children with Burkitt lymphoma. Um, so with HPV vaccine, is it still possible to become infected with the strain that is supposed to prevent? No, okay. Now I I don't know exact numbers of different strains of HPV, but I think there were at least 90 different strains. And the question isn't whether when you get vaccinated with HPV vaccine that you will get the same strain um, infection, which is usually is not. You do not. The only strain that is an exact number of the strain, I think was like 14, 16, 23, something like that, where the strain that is seems to be more detrimental is in the vaccine. Now the question is that when you get vaccine, can you be infected with another strand of or different strand of HIV virus? And the answer is yes, because your body never sees that antigen, right? But hopefully the other strain is not so um, deadly. If it's deadly, well, not deadly, but it's not associated with hepatocellular carcinoma, not hepatocellular, cervical carcinoma. Um, if it is, if that strain it is associated with cervical carcinoma, then they would have used, they would include as part of the vaccine. Okay, let's put it that way. Um, um, what is the? I had a thought. Um, okay, I forgot. It left me. Okay, so mononucleosis caused by the same thing, mono, uh, and uh, also known as kissing disease. Typically, um, a person, um, in with mononucleosis, you see it like in teenager who's just going to college, live in a dormitory, and they can get this mononucleosis. Are there any questions? Any other questions? Okay. Uh, HIV is retrovirus, okay? And retrovirus meaning that uh, it itself is genomic material is RNA that uh, reverse transcribes it to DNA and via the enzyme here called reverse transcriptase. Okay, that converts this, and this is where when people are trying to um, develop different drugs to combat or fight against AIDS, and one of the target area they could say, what if we make an analog of nucleotide, right? So because as the virus uses RNA to make more DNA copy, what if we give a medication like AZT? Okay, AZT is an analog of one of the nucleotide, which means it's similar to. Okay, um, uh, I think it's cytidine triphosphate. Try. Okay. And so basically, the virus, instead of using cytidine, is used this and incorporated to DNA, and now it doesn't work. Right? The virus then cannot do that. But obviously, AZT, can the cells use AZT? Definitely, right? Because it's seen as one of the nucleotide, and people can get like a whole bunch of different side effects. And the way they use AZT as a drug to combat AIDS, uh, during the early 80s, right, late 80s or early 90s, I suppose. Um, it's questionable, but this is where that that movie with Matthew McConaughey with the Dallas Buyer Club, and he's has advocate for the use of this, but knowing that it does help, but it also has a lot of side effects as well. Um, Now, the virus that causes AIDS is known as HIV virus, and there's two kinds, two strain, uh, the strain one and strain two. The common strain, the worldwide, is the type strand one. In the U.S., it's mostly trans two. Okay, yeah. Oh yeah. So one of the I wrote it down here. There, right now, through David Ho's work at Harvard, who advocate for the use what they call it HART. Okay, HART is HA. Okay, HART is then for highly active antivirus therapy. That's what HART is. HART. And essentially, what you do is that you want to treat the patient with HIV virus. They haven't really shown signs yet of AIDS, with a number of drugs, not only targeting the reverse transcriptase, but targeting how the virus entry into CD4 cell. right? So we know that the HIV virus binds to CD4 through their GP120 proteins, right? What if we give the body a lot of CD4 protein, right? Just itself, right? So the hope is that the virus can bind to this CD4, right? And then they'll get rid of the body as opposed to CD4 and then get into your helper T cell. And once they get into your helper T cell over a prolonged period of time, they could destroy your CD4 T cells. If it's less than 200, can lead to a crisis, right? But if you kind of like mask or you protected the CD4 T cell by giving a lot of these, right? Uh, as a buffer, if you will, as a cushion, so the virus can bind to this as opposed to the actual T. So that's one way that people approach it. Um, Viral entry. There's a whole stage of how they can get in. Through there's another protein besides CD4, and that is known as CCR5, which is chemokine receptor 4 and 5. Okay, is another way uh, how the virus can enter into the CD4 is via CCR4 and CCR5. And this was actually discovered is because people like Magic Johnson, who has a defective in chemokine receptor, I believe CCR5, and uh, if that is the case, then the virus have hard time entering CD4 T cell. Okay, his body is exposed to the HIV virus because it's seroconverted. We know he has antibody, but the additional chemokine receptor sort of like allows the people to resistant to the effect of HIV virus. And you might see that in certain population, might be in Africa, where people have mutation in this CCR5. Um, and then there's a whole story about a doctor in China might be involved in human cloning. Uh, and is he involved in making a person who might have a receptor, CCR5 receptor mutation? Does the person might be resistant to HIV virus and so forth? But that's just too much information. I don't want to go there. But the nucleoside analog, dideoxycytidine hybrid, zidovudine, AZT, uh, the ABC, okay, abacavir, all targeting the reverse transcriptase. Uh, there are also other drugs that also target the egression, how virus exit, for example. All of that is part of the HART, or highly active antiretrovirus therapy. Okay, opportunistic infections of AIDS, we will see that typically when your CD4 count goes down, typical yeast infection, right? Candida leads to stomach ache, stomatitis, esophagitis, Candida again. They also get in the lung pneumonia due to pneumocystic cerevisiae or Mycobacterium avium is very common. You will find out that particularly a lot of people who are immunosuppressed, here's another virus called CMV for cytomegalovirus. Right? If you have a normal immune system, um, you know what? Chances are you probably have CMV virus in your body, okay? But they don't really cause any symptom because your immune system keep it in check. When that person is immunosuppressed to taking steroid, particularly if you're a transplant patient, you have to immunosuppress, otherwise your body will reject the tissue or the organ. CMV will come out, and then high CMV can also associated with encephalitis. Uh, so that's a very important. These are the important one that aids that I want you to know. Canada, Cryptococcus neoformans, which is actually fungal infection, causes meningitis, Mycobacterium avium, and Cerevisiae pneumonia. Okay. All right. Bacteria infections, so you can see most of the cocci are gram-positive. The difference between staph and strep, for those who haven't taken microbiology yet, is streptococcus, you usually see a change. Okay, we call that strepto, whereas staphylo is more cluster-like, like that. So that's staph. Um, Gram-positive, usually skin infections is usually gram-positive. Gram-negative or more GI tract, um, like E. coli, Salmonella, all gram-negative. Okay. Now, the only for you guys to note that it's cocci, particularly the diplococci. Okay, diplo means two, so diplococci, right? Think of a cocci, you think of positive, but in this case, diplococci, that is gram-negative, that's Neisseria. And Neisseria gonorrhea, for example, is diplococci negative. MRSA for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, um, and the, of course, penicillin is one of the first antibiotic that has been made. It's produced by a mole, and penicillin uh, typically interfere with this uh, the beta lactamase, which is the enzyme that the um, bacteria made to make the ring important for the peptidoglycan. And the drugs here uh, are interfere with the beta lactamase, and so functions. Then they have a weak cell wall, and the bacteria that treat this uh, um, bacteria uh, with the antibiotic uh, will die, but some of them do resist, and it depends on the antibiotics, and I don't have time to go into different kinds of antibiotics. So some antibiotic, like kanamycins and stuff like that, their targeting is interfere with the translation process from mRNA to protein. Okay, some of them, like here, is targeting the enzyme that makes the cell membrane, right? Cell membrane of the bacteria. Other might be involved with transcription, DNA to RNA, and so forth. And as a result, there are different kinds of resistance, right? Um, the the uh, and I don't have time to go into it. Um, yeah, so some antibiotic that sort of like go into the cell, but the bacteria have a mechanism to pump it out again before it has an effect. So that's one type of antibiotic resistant. Okay. Um, uh, the 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 antibiotic resistant may be inherit a protein that require an enzyme that degrade the antibiotics, right? Or you might have an enzyme. What they do is that once the drug goes into the bacteria, it modifies it, right? Um, Phosphorylated, whatever. So it modifies it so that now it's no longer function. Then that's how bacteria become resistant to certain antibiotics. But I think that's too much for us. MRSA is typically finds in hospital now. It's common, and the problem with um, bacteria is that uh, it's good in the sense of you have a viral or bacterial infection, which one would you like to have? I would say, okay, bacterial infection. Because if I have a bacterial infection, I can treat it with antibiotics, right? Now we have virus, just let it go, let it, the course of the infection go on. You can't do much unless you take antiviral, which could be very, very expensive. With antibiotic, the problem is that people overuse this antibiotics, and if that's the case, then you have bacteria that become resistant to antibiotics, and we have different lines of antibiotics. We don't want to give it right away because if the last lines of antibiotics is given and the bacteria are resistant to that, they become extremely resistant, then you know, once you have that, there's nothing we can do. Um, Certainly in TB, when you have an infections with TB, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, we'll give them ethambutol, isoniazid, but now we see more and more of multi-resistant. So then they're not only just resistant to isoniazid, they're also resistant to ethambutol and other drugs as well, other antibiotics. And that's the dangers of multi-drug resistant or extreme resistant antibiotics. Um, and, I think our last line is vancomycin. And if the vancomycin is resistant, then unless they have some other new one, it's the last defense is hard. Streptococcus called pyogenic inflammation with pus. That's what pyogenic is. Typically in the skin, streptococcus, or in the upper respiratory tract, the pharynx, and sometimes it can also lead to lower lung, like associated. And associated with streptococcus is rheumatic fever. That can also lead to heart valve defect. Neisseria, remember again, Neisseria are dipococci gram-negative. In this case, gonorrhea or meningitis causes meningitis. This Neisseria meningitis is also known as meningococcal meningitis. You can also get vaccination for this. In fact, uh, freshmen who's starting their college going to stay in a dormitory is often recommended that they get the meningococcal meningitis vaccine because we see that in close quarter, like daycare or dormitory, prison, I suppose, too, um, that people can get Neisseria meningitis infection, and they replicate really fast, and from the time of the infection to death, it could be within a week. Gram-negative bacteria H. pylori, often related to peptic ulcer, through the work of Barry Marshall, who shows that people who have peptic ulcer is because they have infection at H. pylori, not because their body produces a lot of acid. And he's demonstrated using what we call it the Koch postulate. Okay, and Koch postulate typically has 4 or 5 conditions that he fulfilled, and to shows that the infectious particle is H. pylori. Okay? E. coli, gram-negative, salmonella, because salmonellosis. Typically, people eat raw egg, hollandaise sauce, or raw chicken. Typically, you see this in fair because the chicken is not properly refrigerated. Shigella, so shigellosis and Fibrio uh, can cause Fibrio dysentery and causes dysentery, for example. Vibrio, sorry, can causes cholera. It's pretty fast dividing organism. Okay? I think the fastest is Vibrio, who can replicate in 16 minutes. In 6 minutes, right? You can get a doubling of Vibrio, whereas E. coli is usually 20 minutes. Are there any questions? Okay. Let's do a couple more and then we'll take a break. Rickettsia is transmitted by insect bite. But rickettsia can actually transmit it by arthropods. So not just um, insects, uh, but lice and and tick and so forth. Some bacteria um, have a corkscrew shape. We call this spirochete. And the only spirochete that I think worth mentioning is Borrelia burgdorferi, Borrelia, right? Which causes Lyme disease. Bordeaux, I think that's Borrelia burgdorferi or recurritis. Um, and it causes Lyme's disease. And Lyme disease is early discovered in Lyme, Connecticut. It's transmitted by a deer tick. Um, and when a deer tick take a blood meal, attaches to your skin, uh, afterward you might have a lesion that looks like a target like this. Okay, it could be the elbow, the knee, the back, right? And you get this target lesion. And Borrelia, actually, once you get infected, it stays in your joint, and it's really hard to get rid of. Some infections are caused by mixtures of organisms, particularly if you have mycobacterium, which considers chronic infection already. And atopically, you can also get, staph or strep on top of that if you're getting TB. Rickettsia, intracellular. Oh, here's the other thing is with rickettsia is that a bacteria, but is a intracellular bacteria. In other words, they can't replicate outside. It's actually require infected the cell it's really hard to culture this. The only way that you can cause rickettsia is if you have live tissue, right, for it to grow in. And it causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Usually that's rash, headache, malaise. It's transmitted to the wood tick or dog ticks, but could be through lice as well. Borrelia, I mentioned, Burgdorferi, or recurrentis, similar thing, Borrelia spirochete, causes Lyme disease. Red center pale circle target is typically what you often see. Acute phase cause lymphadenopathy, joint pain, recurrent fever. That's another strain of Borrelia called recurrentis, in which you get fever that lasts, long time, 10 days. It's fade and it actually come back again. And some of them can also cause nerve damage, and you can get facial paralysis. Okay. Mycobacterium tuberculosis, where it's been 6 years studying. It's considered one of the world's most successful pathogen, and that is the successful pathogen usually don't kill the host. Right? They just infect the host, have an area to live, and they persist for a long time. In fact, 95% of the people who have infected with TB, um, they're, they wall up the infection. Only 5% of the people who have infected with TB will have immediately primary TB. They will come get sick to that. And we now know that these 5% that have, uh, you know, primary tuberculosis is because they have a defective um, pro-inflammatory cytokine, right? So in other words, the immune system is not functioning uh, properly. It defected in interferon gamma or TNF alpha, usually. So they have it. But if you have functional TNF alpha, you just wall off the infection. Um, you PPD test, type 4 hypersensitivity shows that it's positive, but you're not coughing, you're not having a night sweat, and so forth. So you don't have active TB. All right, I'm going to stop here. Are there any questions? Okay, so we'll take a 5-minute break and see how much I can finish with this.